Oh, webcams. That makes perfect sense. Oh, well, that's not going to work. Right. Cool. Well, welcome to any of you who are actually out there in the world paying attention to this and to me. My name is Tim Miller, and you are watching live stream number 1 of the Cinematic Method. This is my new science communication project about filmmaking for scientists. So this is the first in what's going to be a series of, I think it's 16 or something live streams that take place over the course of the project. And the idea behind the live streams is that I'm trying to provide an alternative forum for people who are participating in the project to discuss the things that we've been working on, to talk about the episodes as they come out, to ask questions about things I might have presented in the episodes as they appear, and to get feedback from the people who are participating about what's working or what's not and what they'd like to see or haven't seen yet. So for those of you who might not know what this project is or have stumbled here accidentally, the Cinematic Method is a program that I am building over the course of the next 5 months that is a course in digital filmmaking designed specifically for working scientists. So it's designed to be a comprehensive introduction to the technical and aesthetic aspects of everything about modern motion picture production. And when I say modern motion picture production, I mean producing audio-visual content that includes moving images with synchronized sound. I'm not talking specifically about any form of that or any kind of that content. It might be a presentation for a research talk that you're recording. A lot of the stuff that we'll talk about is relevant to just talking on Zoom or live streaming the way that I'm doing now. It might be preparing a persuasive film, or it might be participating in some way in a bigger project like a TV show or a movie. But the fundamental principles are all the same for those things. And the reason why that's so interesting to me and why I think it's especially useful to talk about in relation to scientists today is that the way that we make movies, the technology, the science behind movie making has in the last 20 years undergone a complete revolution in that every part of the filmmaking experience, first sound and then editing and then camera, has gone from an analog process to a digital process. This has finally been completed with cameras all moving to digital, getting away from any analog storage media just in the last sort of 5 years. Film, regular film strip film is now gone from the film business completely. Almost no one shoots on it. Films are no longer distributed on film. It is not, basically everything is digital. So that means a couple of important things. The first thing it means is that the cameras, the equipment are less expensive because digital technology has driven those costs down considerably. But most importantly, it means that there's no variable cost to creating material. So in the old days, it cost money based on how much time you wanted to record, right? Film came in a reel that was measured in feet, and that number of feet could represent a certain amount of time of recording or of filming. With digital, all of those restrictions are gone. You can film as much stuff as you want, provided that you have enough storage space. And all the editing stuff is also now digital. So those things together all mean that the tools of filmmaking have been democratized in a really important way. Most of you have already all of the cameras and computer equipment that you would need to make a very sophisticated film, but you don't necessarily have the technical or aesthetic know-how to figure that stuff out. So that's what we're trying to do with the cinematic method. It's a series of 9 episodes that come with exercises and lists of things to do, like a regular sort of unit lesson plan, that are designed to give an absolute novice, someone who doesn't know anything about video or filmmaking, the technical expertise necessary and some of the aesthetic inclinations necessary to go out and put something together. And I think that's necessary because we as scientists are being asked to interact with video and film content so much more now than we were in the past. Increasingly, we're being asked to create films about ourselves or for ourselves, and I do some of that work. I mean, we do freelancing stuff, creating science content. But a lot of those requests I get are things that I think to myself, you know, a competent graduate student of yours who knew just a few basic things could easily put this together. In fact, could probably put it together more effectively than I could because she knows the subject more intimately than I do. So that's the thing that we're really trying to achieve here with the cinematic method, is a comprehensive resource for technically inclined people, scientists, to go to learn the things they might want to know about making film and video. And that's everything from how to use the camera, how to record sound, how to put images together in post-production, how to mix them together with titles, how you write and plan for what you're going to shoot before you shoot it, how you budget these things, all of that stuff. I've spent the last 3 of the last 4 years building an all-new digital filmmaking curriculum at the University of Connecticut. And so this stuff is all based on those, you know, undergraduate and graduate film courses that I've developed. I'm trying to condense sort of the first year of film school into 9 episodes. And believe it or not, I think that's actually possible because the fact that film is now digital means that understanding it and how it works requires a certain level of technical acumen that I know that all of you already have. So when we talk about movies and movie making, I'm going to try and talk about it in a kind of math and engineering-y kind of way. I may even make reference to some code snippets that are used to manipulate stuff. More and more in Hollywood, we are looking for and employing people who have technical backgrounds, because the kinds of stuff that we do in Hollywood now is so technical. And I hope that my thesis on this project is that I can use that fact to create a training resource for you guys that's considerably condensed from the way we present it to film students. So that's what the cinematic method is, and that's what we're going to be doing over the next 5 or 6 months. As I said, it's 9 episodes. The first of them will be released on January 15th, and we're going to go from there. So thank you to all of you who are joining me tonight, all 2 of you who have joined me so far tonight, but anybody who's watching this as an introduction to the project, thank you and welcome. And I also wanted to say on behalf of, I'm sure everybody who's going to watch this, that this week, I've waited to start this project. We talked about this project in September, but I waited to start it until November because I, especially over the last week, have slowly begun breathing my own collective sigh of relief about the direction that America may be headed in. I think, like most people who work in and study the sciences, I have been pretty unhappy over the last 4 years with the way the current thankfully, outgoing now administration treated science. This project is happening at a time when, a lot of bad stuff is happening in America. And most of it, is in some way related to science. Obviously, the COVID pandemic is the biggest of those, and information or disinformation about that is the most obvious ramification. But there's science and technology involved in our politics and in our voting, and the degree to which we have seen science not just ignored, but actively attacked is, to me, and I hope to most of you, extremely troubling and unsettling. And should be, I hope, a warning to all of us that we need to think very hard about doing what we have been doing differently. I wanted to start with an article that appeared in Wired this week by writer Roxanne Comsey, who was a colleague of mine, about how frustrating it is that the public health information about COVID that has been presented is so rarely accompanied by the scientific rationale or explanation for that public health advice. And Roxanne was very active and vocal at the very beginning of the pandemic, chasing down these claims that everyone was making that COVID was not airborne. And Roxanne, to her great credit, was like, well, what exactly do you mean by that? Because if it's transmitted through the air, then that's an airborne illness. And now we do think of it as an airborne illness. Roxanne's piece this week was about how we muddy the water when we don't offer any scientific rationale for public health decisions. And I want to read you a short quote from this piece. She says, "When health authorities present one rule after another without clear science-based substantiation, their advice ends up seeming arbitrary and capricious. That erodes public trust and makes it harder to implement rules that do make sense." And I couldn't agree more with that. That she uses the phrase arbitrary and capricious there, which is a thing, if any of you have studied the law, a phrase that you hear in the law. So arbitrary and capricious just means it's arbitrary, meaning it comes from nowhere, and it's capricious, meaning it's the caprice of the individual. It's the whim of the elected official who's making that rule. And I think that she's 100% right about that. Now, it's true that public health decisions need to be balanced between not just the science, but also some other considerations. But it would be a tremendously beneficial thing if the public who were being informed were also at least made aware of where that information was coming from. But Roxanne, I think, is at this place where she's 100% right that this conflicting public health information muddies the water and makes it more difficult to implement rules that do make sense. It does erode public trust. But the degree to which public trust is eroded by public health advice that doesn't cite the science pales in comparison to the degree to which public trust is destroyed, not just eroded slowly, but actively destroyed or removed by a chief executive who is actively disseminating scientific disinformation, information that we know to be scientifically false. And we've never seen anything like that in America before. We have seen some administrations that seemed willing to ignore facts that were inconvenient for them. We've seen administrations challenge science directly on contentious issues that threatened wedge issues of theirs that they use to divide the electorate. But we've never seen an American politician. I would argue that Trump's not really a politician, but nonetheless, we've never seen an American elected official so openly and so brazenly disputing clear and settled scientific advice about what needs to be done. And make no mistake, that choice has cost tens of thousands, probably now hundreds of thousands of American lives that did not need to be lost. The President of the United States lied to the American people about an infectious disease that he and his advisors knew was going to be exceptionally deadly. And as a result, 100, 200,000 Americans who would be with us today are now dead. And so I want to start by saying that this project comes along at a time when I think we as scientists or as members of the American scientific community, if we're being truthful, have to be willing to say that science has failed in America, that American science has failed, that we've gone terribly wrong. Now, I know many of you, and especially those of you who work in epidemiology or infectious disease research, are saying, listen, my science didn't fail at all. I absolutely had the right answer, and I was able to deliver that answer to the people who could have been able to act on it, but they didn't. And I thank you all so much for your work, and I don't dispute that your science was accurate or correct. My point is that the scientific enterprise, the scientific endeavor, the national effort at science has failed. We must say that it has failed if what we're seeing is this country being the worst in the developed world at combating this virus. The fact that we have a president of the United States who is willing to disseminate known disinformation about public health is shocking and appalling to me. But the fact that that individual was able to get elected president of the United States is more troubling to me. The erosion of public trust that allows a significant portion of the electorate to brazenly reject, even flout public health advice doesn't happen in 4 years. It happens over the course of many decades. And I think that if we are interested in changing that, in moving on from that, in building a better, not just society, not just science, but society based on science, we as scientists, as a scientific community, need to be willing to recognize that we have failed, that something has gone wrong. And I should say that I'm not trying to blame all of you out there for the science that you've been doing or haven't been doing. I place myself first on that list of people who I think deserve blame, because I have spent my career claiming to be an expert in scientific communication. And I have made my living for many years traveling the country, giving lectures and speeches to scientists in an attempt to improve their style of communication. And looking back, I guess I realized that I saw that the injuries to science, that the deficiencies, that the problems were bad, were structural, were systemic. But I didn't argue or advocate particularly strongly for trying to change those things. I think probably because I was making a decent living pretending like I was going to change them on my own, right? I knew that these were wounds that required stitches or surgery, but I was making money selling Band-Aids. And so I kept selling Band-Aids. And I think that, and I am forced to admit that, that means that I am part of this systemic cultural failure that I'm describing in science. These are, I think for many of us, dark days, a scary time. I got most of my uncontrollable sobbing out this morning, so I don't think I'm going to break down while on camera here tonight. But I have, almost daily kind of periods of freaking out. I think most of us do. It's easy to be freaking out right now, especially if you're someone who really likes evidence-based approaches to things. So I don't think that we should be freaking out. I hope that these weekly streams will provide some people with a sense of comfort or relaxation about that. I don't think that American society is going to crumble, but I do recognize that it is a dark time. I think we all need to recognize that. A dark time for science and a dark time for America. It's going to be a dark winter. And I think it's important to say that and to recognize that and embrace that. If you, like me, are someone who's really concerned with really making American science not just better, but great, because I believe that American science can be, should be, often is great, I think you have to be willing to admit that we, science, bear some of the blame for what is happening in America today. If you're not willing to admit that, I doubt that you can be part of meaningful change. As I said, I put myself first on the list of people who I believe have failed here. And my sense of failure, of personal failure, is particularly acute when I think about one individual. Laura, can you show the photograph? This is a picture of a scholar named Aaron Schwartz, who was a contemporary of mine while I was working at the Museum of Science in Boston. Aaron was brilliant, a programmer, a coder, an advocate for open internet societies, a student and an acolyte of Lawrence Lessig at MIT, at Harvard or MIT. And I was reporting on him while he was engaged in his most visible activism. He was in Cambridge and I was in Cambridge. The Museum of Science in Boston is in both Boston and Cambridge, and the stages are on the Cambridge side. And he was my age, and so I followed along and paid a lot of attention to what he was doing, because Aaron became the most articulate and forceful advocate for changing what I believe is the most important structural fault that currently exists in the American scientific enterprise, and that is the system of academic publishing. Aaron, like many young people in the early part of the 20th century, believed, as I did, that the emergence of digital technologies meant that we must take responsibility for disseminating the results of science using those digital technologies as broadly and as widely as was physically possible. And Aaron grew increasingly frustrated, as did many of us, with the field's refusal to move in that direction. What happened, as those of you who are old enough to remember this, was that as more and more publications went digital, the access to those papers, once they were published, became more and more restricted, right? There were fewer and fewer ways to get at scientific publishing, and the publishers were getting tighter and tighter about allowing digital access. Now, Aaron recognized that this was a dangerous and troubling trend in American society, and he became a pretty radical activist and advocate preaching against this trend. In 2008, he wrote a document called the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto. His frustration with trying to prod the system in the right direction had grown to a place where he said, no, more radical action is now required. And he said a bunch of things in that document. But the most relevant of it, I think, today is, he said, there is no justice in following unjust laws. It is time to declare our opposition to this private theft of public culture. And Aaron was absolutely right about that. Lawrence Lessig said he was absolutely right. I and all of my contemporaries at the time believed that he was absolutely right about that. But the tactic that he chose to pursue this radical agenda was a bit extreme, in my opinion. Aaron decided that he was going to start collecting digital versions of as many scientific articles as he possibly could. And what the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto called for was for all other scientists to do exactly the same thing, to use the privileges that were given to you by your university or the institution with which you are affiliated to get digital copies of as much scientific literature as you possibly could, with the goal of sharing it somehow, if necessary, eventually, without the permission of the legal copyright holders, who were the publishers of that material. And so Aaron set up a system to start downloading papers from the MIT library. The gateway at a regular computer quickly limited him to a certain number of requests that could tell what he was doing. So he wrote a simple script to ping multiple requests at the highest rate imaginable, and he plugged it directly into a switch in a supply closet in the basement. So if you know anything about internet switching technologies, if you plug into the switch, it's a lot faster. And he jimmy-picked a lock in the closet to get in there to plug his computer in. And he downloaded, I don't know, 100,000 articles or something from Elsevier. I believed, well, he downloaded something like 100,000 scientific papers because he believed, as I did, that it was preposterous for the publisher to claim that the American people did not have the right to read that material. Aaron believed that because the federal government takes money from American citizens and redistributes that money to scientific researchers to do scientific research, those taxpayers have a fundamental right to read the results that are generated by that research. And what the publishers were doing then and are still doing now was hiding that research behind paywalls and asking the taxpayers who had foot the bill for the research in the first place to pay additional fees to the publisher to access the results. And I briefly was caught in that bind because I graduated I left grad school and I got to the museum, which carried a gratis appointment at Harvard, but it took a couple of months for that to come through. And so for several months, I was stuck in this limbo where I didn't have a library card or a university affiliation. And in trying to access scientific papers to do my job at the museum, I kept hitting these paywalls. So Aaron downloaded 100,000 copies of what he and I both believed were illegally taxed tea. And I believe that it was his intention to dump that tea into Boston Harbor. But before I got a chance to do anything with it, he was tracked down and tackled, arrested by the MIT police. And the Obama administration decided to really throw the book at Aaron. He was charged with multiple federal felonies, with violating a couple provisions of the DMCA and this anti-hacking law from the 80s. Basically, they took every federal piece of legislation they could and said, "You're guilty of all these terrible things, you horrible felon." Without, I think, any real recognition that he was a scholar and an academic and a man trying to prove a point about civil disobedience, and a young man who certainly made a questionable judgment call. And in 2012 or 13, I believe 2013, while he's on trial for his life in Boston, they got to this point in the case where the government said, "Okay, Aaron, listen, we know that you didn't really mean to steal these things, and we want this case to go away too. So here, we'll offer you this deal where you won't have to serve any prison time, and we'll basically let you go. But you have to plead guilty to a federal felony." And he refused because he didn't think he was a felon, because he wanted to stand on the principle of the thing, and also because, and this is the part that breaks my heart, he knew that if you were a convicted felon, you couldn't ever get a job working at the White House. And a few weeks after that plea deal was rejected, Aaron was found dead by suicide in his apartment in New York. That was in 2013. I believe it's 2013. If I have the date of his death wrong, I apologize. I'll get it right for the next one. And since his death, there has been a palpable silence in the scientific community about the issues that he raised, about the thing for which he fought so hard and ultimately lost his life fighting. Many of us, and if I'm honest, myself included, backed away from that issue a little bit for fear of how hard the powers that be seemed willing to come down. And so the situation today is that same one that Aaron hated so much. The research is hidden behind paywalls. The taxpayers who fund the research are not allowed to read the results. And I go to universities around the country and I talk about this issue now, and I have not found anyone, anywhere in the American scientific community who is willing to offer a vigorous and full-throated defense of that status quo. Everyone you talk to says it sucks. Young people or young scientists tend to say, it sucks, it's terrible, what can we do? We got to tear the whole thing down. Older, more successful scientists say, it's got very serious problems that we need to find some way to remedy without destroying the whole system. Basically, everybody knows the system is bad. The people for whom it brought success want to keep it, and the people for whom it did not yet bring success want to throw it out. But the truth is that that system's not just bad. That system is fundamentally unjust. And I am no longer going to be referring to the push to change that system as an open access movement. I am going to be arguing for what I call the publication of science. Because the verb to publish does not mean to print. It means to make public. This came to me a number of times reading Roxanne and Ed Yong's work at the Atlantic. A number of science writers have pointed out that all of the COVID material that we see being generated in labs and posted online immediately has not yet been peer reviewed or published. And I think that's evidence of how much we're misusing those words and how much we've lost sight of those concepts. A scientific paper is posted publicly and every scientist all the way around the world can read it and offer commentary and criticism. But that's not peer review. It's on the internet for anybody on earth to go look at and read and make sense of for themselves, but it's not published. I just think that's crazy. I think that's evidence of how far we've gotten away from what the idea behind scientific publishing was. And it's important to remember that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when scientific publishing was send a paper off to a journal, they would accept it or reject it, it would be reviewed, there'd be revisions, it would get printed, it would go into the journal would come to the library. We built that system because it was the most openly accessible, widely available, broadly disseminable model that was possible using the technology. Throughout the 20th century, we did everything we could to make science more and more and more accessible to people. The science itself, the real science, the literature. But in the 21st century, we have allowed that pathway to get narrower and narrower and narrower. We've allowed those doorways to close. And it is the case now that in every major scientific laboratory in America, there are working scientists, PhD candidates, who in the course of the conduct of their scientific research at American institutions are on a weekly basis committing federal felonies in order to get their work done. We all do it. We're all out there ICANN has PDFing left and right. We're illegally sharing scientific documentation back and forth among us, the scientists, because there isn't a clear legal way to do it. And if that's not evidence of a horrible problem, I don't know what is. So I know this sounds like me getting on my soapbox and it's not about movie making yet. I promise it will be about movie making. This project is all about movie making. But I'm doing it because I want so badly for there to be a fundamental change in the way we do science in America. And I want it because we have proved that science in America isn't working. So I promise that it's not going to be all Tim getting angry and yelling at the camera throughout this entire project, although I would probably have more YouTube followers if I did. We're going to talk about films and filmmaking, but I do think that we need to think fundamentally about how we are doing the science itself, because I do think fundamentally the way we do the science itself needs to change. Some of you are probably thinking, well, Tim, this is a crazy like disconnect that you have between publishing and, public understanding of science. Those are two totally different things. Publishing is just for scientists. Public understanding is a thing that science communicators or science explainers should do. And I couldn't possibly disagree more. The reason I disagree so much is that, and those of you who have studied the sciences know this, there are a huge number of people in America who have very good scientific training, who have credentials, who have PhDs, who spent time in labs, but for whatever reason are doing something else now than working in academic science. Some of them are communicators like me. Some of them are writers and artists. Some of them are working in outreach or education. Some of them are working in politics. Some of them are journalists. Some of them are lawyers. Some of them are stay-at-home parents. But all of those people are also members of American society, members of the general public, who, if they had access to it, would be following along with the most current and relevant research and becoming trusted centers of thought in their local communities, in their church groups and school districts and in whatever else that they are involved in. But they can't do that today because they don't have access to the literature. And despite the limited successes that the open access movement has had, it's still the case that the more high profile an article is, the better a journal it gets placed in, the more likely it is to be locked behind a paywall. So when the cinematic method is over, I'm planning to spend most of my time ramping up advocacy and activism about that. Because the guy who I was hoping would be in charge of activism and advocacy about that is dead. He was a lot smarter than I am. He was a better coder and he was more passionate. He was one of the best minds of my generation. And he was destroyed by madness. So when this project is over, I'm going to try and pick up the work where he left it off. And I'm hoping that some of you who come with me on this journey about learning to use this medium of the lens will be interested in joining me in that struggle. Aaron wanted the change to come fast, so he went alone. I want the change to go far, so I'm hoping that many of us will do it together. And that's enough of me soapboxing about politics. Maybe we'll have a short 10-minute section at the end of every one of these streams called Tim's Soapbox, where I can actually get up on a soapbox and just talk about politics. But the truth of the matter is that scientific communication and the role that science plays in American society is now a political question. I don't think that you can have a discussion about science in America today. You can't have a discussion about science in America today without it becoming political. I wish that weren't so, but it is. So what we're going to try and do in the cinematic method is teach you guys a little something about how to use the medium, about how you can put it to use for yourself, not just as a creator of content, but as a much more discriminating consumer. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about throughout the course, is that if you really want to get good at this, if you want to develop some true expertise, my course isn't going to get you there. Hopefully, my course will provide the information that you need to develop, to cultivate a personal practice, which might someday result in expertise, But just the information itself isn't going to get you there. It's an art. And in the arts, we use what we call the Conservatory Approach, which is about practice. It's often about imitation at first. It's about active reading or viewing, deconstruction. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to concentrate on here. I'm hoping that anyone who goes through this will, even if you don't feel empowered to create motion picture content, will feel much more sophisticated about consuming it. Because so much of what we see today, especially the disinformation that we see today, is presented through video. And in the recent testimony that Jack and Mark have had to give at Congress about their platforms, there has been a lot of discussion about how video is the sort of most difficult thing to police on social media platforms. And so if you know something about how those things are put together, if you know something about how the illusions of motion pictures can be created, I think you can be more savvy and more sophisticated as a consumer about what is and is not really going on and what you think you're seeing on the screen. And that's, I guess, what I want to talk about tonight as our first sort of lesson about filmmaking, is what filmmaking is, right? What a film is. What is a movie? What is video? And it's worth talking about because we have so many different words for it now, and the old words don't make nearly as much sense as they used to. So you'll hear me say film, movie, motion picture. I may say cinematograph. I hope I don't, but I may. Video, stream. These things all mean now the same things. I might say show or series or TV show. And if you're searching on Netflix for stuff to watch, which you undoubtedly are because you're home during pandemic, the old definitions of things don't make any sense anymore. What's a movie and what's a TV show? I've seen a lot of people on Twitter lately talking about the Queen's Gambit, which I personally loved because I like chess and because I sympathize with a character who's hailed by some as a genius, but who's really struggling with their own mental health. And because there's a couple scenes in the movie about this very young person in the care of a mom who's really struggling with mental health issues, and that hit home for me very powerfully. But so anyway, people are calling this a TV show, and it's not a TV show. It's a movie. Queen's Gambit is a movie in 7 parts. It's a film. The difference between movies and TV used to be super obvious, right? Because one you had to go out for and one you could stay home for. But in 2020, that's like a lot less clear. From a writer's perspective, we used to say the difference between movies and TV is that in movies, the characters always change. The character goes on some journey from the beginning to the end, and he's a different character at the end than he was at the beginning. Luke Skywalker in the beginning of Star Wars is a bratty kid. I was going to the Toshi station to pick up some power converters. And by the end is a hero of the rebellion. Sam Malone is the same every episode of Cheers, or of Friends, or of any other sitcom. I don't know if there have been new ones since then. I stopped watching them after Friends, but you know what I mean. An episode of a TV show went around and came back to the beginning. The characters were the same at the end of the episode as they were at the beginning. And you could take any season of a sitcom, say, and shuffle the episodes and put them in a new order and watch them again, and they would still make exactly the same amount of sense. The same thing's true of dramas, by the way. You could take almost any episode of The West Wing, the first 2 within one season, shuffle around the episodes within The West Wing and watch them, and they almost all make sense. It's not serialized. Television didn't work that way. But what's happened is we've made these things that we call TV shows, which are written much more like big, huge, long movies. The Queen's Gambit is one example. It's a relatively short, long movie. But there are many, many more. And at the same time, the thing that we call movies have become much, much more episodic. So you go to the MCU thing and you watch an Avengers movie, but the superhero characters are still superheroes at the end, and then you go back and watch the same thing. This goes back, by the way, before superhero movies. The James Bond franchise is a great example. James Bond doesn't change from movie to movie, and he doesn't really change over the course much of one film. That's a lot more like a TV show. So those words have all gotten mixed up. And what does video mean? What's video as opposed to TV? Mostly what we mean when we say video is motion picture content that's of a slightly lower quality. It used to mean something different because video was a thing that was shot on videotape, and it was easily discernible from film because it didn't look as good. But those distinctions went away, I think largely because the aesthetic distinctions went away. When I got to film school, so I started film school at the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. And when I got there in 2010, they had just thrown out all of their, Steenbeck editing flatbed stuff and the Bolexes and 60 millimeter Reflexes that they used to use for first year film students. So my film school instruction was all digital from the beginning. And the reason that's a significant change is that at the time in 2010, this new generation of cameras came out that was capable of shooting video to digital memory cards that looked as good as film. It was driven largely by what's now called the DSLRs, the digital single lens reflex cameras. This is like a SLR that looks like a camera you'd recognize. Actually, Laurel, can you hand me if you open the second drawer? I think my 7D is in there. I really love this compared to the Q show because I now have my partner Laurel assisting me and I don't have to do everything myself. So this is a Canon 7D. This was my first cinema camera that I bought. I was in film school. I still have it. And it's just a digital still camera, a photo camera. But the camera manufacturers discovered that they could very easily just have it take 24 pictures a second and it became a movie camera. And the DSLR revolution changed everything about how student films are made and how indie films are made. And it meant that you could make this highest looking level quality of content with almost no money. And that was really a huge and important change. And it's driven all of these changes that we see throughout the rest of the entertainment industry. And I think that I should say that I think that this new content is the most exciting and engaging kind of motion picture content that we've ever seen. Long form motion picture content, long form serialized motion picture, what I'm starting now to call the novel motion picture, because it is the new form of storytelling. We call book novels because they were a new kind of book in like 1840. I think eventually you have to give up the title of being novel. I think that we will start to think of them as novel films, and they're significant to society in the way that novels were significant to society in the 19th and early 20th century. One of my favorites is David Simon's The Wire, which is a 5-season television show that I think it was like 11 or 12 episodes per season. We call those episodes and seasons, but they're not episodes. It's not episodic. You can't watch them out of order, and they're not seasons in the traditional TV sense. I think they will come to be known. I hope they will come to be known as volumes and chapters, right? So that Wallace gets killed in volume 1, not in season 1, right? And I think that they may even come more sort of where the chapters are sort of becomes less relevant. We start to think of The Wire as a single thing in the same way that we think of Bleak House as a single thing or Great Expectations as a single thing. The novels of Charles Dickens, those are both examples of novels of Charles Dickens. I have to remember that scientists might not know much about English literature. Were published serially, right? You couldn't just buy the whole book. They were published a chapter at a time in magazines. But nobody remembers that today except Dickens scholars. And I hope that the same thing will become true about long form content. So it's, I think, the most exciting possible time to be interested in learning about this stuff because the tools have never been more widely available than they are today. And anybody who is interested can get those tools and put themselves can get those tools in their hands and put themselves together some content that can be pretty powerful. And I should say that the reason that I'm so interested in this and engaged in it is that motion picture has this ability to move us in a way that no other medium yet devised seems to do, including all the new ones. I was a professor of digital media and design, and I played with AR and VR and all the kind of text 3D everything. I was a reporter for this place called the Entertainment Technology Center at USC, and I got to play with all the newest, coolest doodads. But a good, regular, old, flat 2D film with good sound is still, I think, the most powerful form of communication. I should say the most powerful mediated form of communication that humans have. The most powerful form of human communication is two people face to face in a room, bar none. But over some medium, I think it's impossible to beat film. But it's worth noting that throughout the last century or so, more than that now, 120 years that film has been with us, that power has been put to as many evil purposes as it has good, right? The horrifying legacy of white supremacy in America and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan has, I think, its 20th century origins in a film, in one specific film, in a film that they made me watch in my first film class in 1996 without pointing out that it was the film that kind of started a resurgence of white supremacy in America. It's called The Birth of a Nation, and it's monstrous. A female filmmaker named Leni Riefenstahl made a film about Hitler's rally at Nuremberg in 1934 called The Triumph of the Will. Hitler understood motion pictures and radio at a time when they were new and most other politicians didn't. Kind of in the way that Trump understands Twitter, I think, actually. And she made this documentary about how Nazism was going to save Germany. And it's horrifying. And it led to the Nazi regime becoming as powerful and destructive as it was. Film has also done a tremendous amount of good in the world. Don't get me wrong. I think that the issues of racial justice and of gender equality, marriage equality, there have been a lot of things in American life that have been hugely advanced by film taking, deciding to take liberal tacks on things. And that happened in a number of instances. My point is the technology of motion pictures, like every other technology, isn't good and it isn't evil. The phrase I like to use to describe that phenomenon is the knife that carves the roast to soothe a child's cry of hunger could slice the throat to silence it. I know that sounds gruesome, but it's worth thinking about. A kitchen knife can carve the Thanksgiving turkey and feed your kids, or can kill them. The knife doesn't know the difference. Flesh will yield to steel. That's just how it is. The difference dwells in the hand that wields the blade. Okay? So I think it's important for scientists to get their minds and brains and arms around this medium of communication, because there's lots of people who do have their arms around this medium of communication and who are hell-bent on working against the interests that I think we as a scientific community could all agree we want to promote. So if we want to fight back against that, we need to arm ourselves with, I'm going to start that again. If we want to fight back against that, we need to arm ourselves with the most powerful weapons at our disposal. And I believe that this is one of them. So that's why I'm doing this project. The last thing that I want to say about these things, and I think I said that I was going to talk tonight about science communication at Thanksgiving dinner, which I think maybe I'll say for next Thursday, and we'll do a thing on Thanksgiving about that. I don't know what to say about science communication at Thanksgiving dinner. I hoped that after the election, there would be a sense of relief, or at least of reconciliation across the country. I don't see it happening yet, but maybe it will. If you are able to see or talk to your loved ones at Thanksgiving dinner, here's a piece of science communication that I want you to do. I want you to do some data gathering. What are the things that you think really drive Americans apart? What are the things that Americans really disagree about? And if you have the chance to talk to your loved ones, especially if you have loved ones who are of a different political persuasion than yours, do some data gathering on that, because I think you might be surprised what you learn. There are a few issues that we think divide us as Americans: abortion, immigration, guns. But if you start talking about what do you actually want to do to try and change those things, I think you can get to a much more productive conversation a lot faster. So I encourage you to have those conversations, especially if you do have loved ones who might not share your political persuasions, because the things that tie us together as Americans are, I think, much more powerful than the things that drive us apart. And it really hurt me over the course of the election to hear a number of my academic friends really lambasting people in middle America, mostly rural America, for being uneducated, bigoted, misogynist assholes, basically, for being bad people. Now, I have an extremely low opinion of Donald Trump as a person and a figure in political life. And I recognize that he has given cover to a lot of really reprehensible bigotry in America. But I refuse to believe that all 70 million of the Americans who voted for him are racist, terrible bigots. And I want to caution all of you against falling into the trap that may be so. Because the truth is that people who live in rural America, who might not have access to the kinds of education that we have had access to, who don't have experience in cities or cosmopolitan areas of the world, who live in many parts of rural America, like Vermont, where I am now, where life is a little quieter and slower and more about the community around you. Those Americans are, by and large, overwhelmingly hardworking, honest, patriotic people who are not horrifying racists and who are not bigots or monsters, who love their families, who love their children, and who love their country, and who, frankly, would benefit and be willing to advocate for a lot of the policies that those of us on the left want the most. And it is also true that those people in those communities work their asses off at jobs and in industries, particularly in agriculture, upon which we absolutely depend for our survival. And a portion of the money that they earn with their labor feeding us, we take from them so that we can go off into our labs and do the work that we say is necessary for them and the society in which they live. But we publish the results of that research in privately controlled journals, often privately controlled by for-profit foreign corporations, and then we tell those Americans to go do business with those corporations if they want to read the results of the work that they funded. Do you question why conspiracy theories that claim that scientists are part of an organized cabal that hates America find such fertile ground? Does it surprise you that it's easy to turn those people against us? Because it doesn't surprise me at all. And if we want, and I desperately want, to see meaningful change in science and in America, we are never going to get there yelling at the other side that they're wrong. This is a democracy, and that means in order to change things, we need to get together. So that's my advice for you for science communication over Thanksgiving dinner is talk to your family, even the people with whom you disagree the most. Ask them what they want to do and why they want to do it. Because if you can get to why they want those things, you might find that we don't disagree nearly as much as we think we do. That's it for tonight. I promised myself I'm going to wrap every live stream up at 1 hour. I don't know if we will be back next Thursday or not. I'll send it out on Twitter. Probably I will because it's Thanksgiving Day, but probably I will because you guys can't go to Thanksgiving anyway. And this is good for me too. The last thing I'll leave you with is going to be the first thing that you'll see in episode 1 of the cinematic method when it's unveiled in January. And that is the first thing that you need to know about moving pictures is that they are always nothing but an illusion. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time, I'm Tim Miller.